Hi, welcome to Al-Muqaddimah. My name is Syawish. So I was in Washington, D.C. recently, and while I was there, I recorded a lot of footage in a vlog style to show people around the city and discuss its history, but it was quite windy that day, so a lot of that footage is unfortunately useless. So I will be mixing some footage from that day and some footage that I'm recording today and trying to make a cohesive video. So if there are some janky cuts here and there, sorry about that. While I was in DC, I was thinking a lot about what it means to be great. The city is, after all, full of monuments built to people that someone thought were great. There were also a lot of Make America Great Again hats being sold everywhere. I saw an immigrant woman, an Asian immigrant, selling hats that, said Make America Great Again. She was also selling both Trump and Harris t-shirts, which is peak America if you ask me. Now, all four parts of that statement, Make America Great Again, can be challenged, right? Like, what does it mean to make something great? Can you make something great, or is it something inherent? Something you are rather than something you do? What is America? More importantly, who is America? This greatness that we're talking about, who will share in it? Is a country great if it can project its power all over the globe, but its own citizens go bankrupt and even die from fairly curable diseases simply because they can't afford the treatment? Finally, making America great again means that it was great at some previous time. When was that? No matter what time you give, there will be someone who will quickly, and rightfully so, point out that while that time was great for a certain set of people, it was pretty bad for others, usually minorities and women. I am personally of the opinion that the United States can't be great, and that it never was great. No country is or can be great. A country is merely a vessel. It's merely a set of people with a set of ideas and policies. When the government changes, everything changes, as Ukraine has sadly found out recently. So to say that a state is great or evil, I think, is simply too simplifying. A state is too big for us to make such sweeping generalizations. It has so many people who want so many different and often contradictory things. But I do believe that moments of greatness shine through in the history of every country. Even in its darkest time, a country can have some moments of greatness. For the United States, my favorite moments of greatness are at the very beginning. Before we continue, I'd like to tell everyone that my merchandise store is now up on almuqaddimah.com, where you can find awesome wall posters like the Timeline of Islamic History, which condenses 1400 years plus of Islamic history into a beautiful timeline. We also have a map of the fall of Al-Andalus, which shows century by century how Muslim empires lost ground in Spain and Portugal until their eventual collapse on the Iberian Peninsula. New stuff is being added all the time, so be sure to check it out. That's the best way to support Al-Muqaddimah and show off some love for Islamic history as well. People tend to forget that the United States' founding is an event of incredible historical rarity. At the time of its founding, there were no democracies. Athens hadn't been a democracy for over 2,000 years. Even republics that had existed never took such a large percentage of their population into their electoral process. Athens, for example, never had its women, its slaves, or its immigrants voting. But then again, neither did the United States at the beginning. So for the founding fathers of the United States, there was no blueprint or template to work off of. They looked at other countries like England and France, but they couldn't copy anyone one-to-one because there was no other country like it. And that led to a lot of debate. And I think it's in those moments of debate that something was great in that country. They debated what the country is gonna be and had discussions about the rights of the people, calling it home. Of course, all that talk of liberty and freedom was merely hot air. to the ears of millions of people who were enslaved in that very country. And we'll come back to that. But among all those debates, there was one that really fascinates me. The debate on what role religion will play in the United States. Most countries and empires in the world, up to this point, had been guided by some kind of religious traditions and beliefs. You would have Muslim empires where the rulers are Muslim, but the majority of the population isn't. But still, they have to live by what a particular interpretation of Islam decides for them. The same is true for Christian empires and Zoroastrian empires. No matter how nice a government was, if you didn't believe in the faith of the ruling class, you were not equal to the people who did. But the United States was going to be different. Even though the founding fathers were all Christian, or at least came from a Christian background, they wanted religion to not be a factor in how the government treats someone. One of the biggest proponents of this was Thomas Jefferson. We'll come back to why he had a Qur'an in a minute, but first, let's talk about what Europeans and Americans of this generation thought about Islam. I would argue, actually not even argue, I believe it to be a fact, that the view of Islam that's too common here in the West comes from the Crusades. In a way, interactions between these two civilizations, perhaps if that's the right word, have been stuck in that period. During the colonial era, it did change, but at that time the Christian colonizers and the Muslim colonized weren't equal. So whatever they thought of each other at the time, I don't think it applies anymore, largely speaking. Like, there's still that idea of Muslims being primitive and the Christians being aggressive imperialists, but I think largely we're back to the Crusades. Anyhow, at the time of the founding of the United States, Islam was a specter that was haunting Europe. A little less than a century before the Declaration of Independence was signed, the Ottoman Empire had tried to take Vienna. Even though they failed and never tried again, it was still a deeply traumatic event for European thinkers, and its memory was quite alive as the Age of Enlightenment came around. On top of that, of course, was the memory of the Protestant Reformation. During the Protestant Reformation, both the Protestants, led by Martin Luther, and the Catholics, led by the Pope, had accused each other of being Muslims. There was all this imagery of the Antichrist, who appeared as an amalgamation of the Pope or Martin Luther on the one hand and Prophet Muhammad or the Ottoman Sultan on the other. Luther also had the Qur'an translated into Latin to show people how full of, quote, lies and fables it was. Not many thinkers in the 1700s had a good or even neutral idea of Islam. It was mostly negative and sometimes very, very negative at that. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire started to use Islam and the Ottoman Sultan as a thinly veiled stand-in for their own governments. Basically, they were talking about their own tyrannical governments by talking about the Ottoman Sultan instead, who was seen as a debaucherous tyrannical monarch, even though in reality he wasn't any more or less tyrannical than the average European monarch. This practice came to the colonies as well, and it continued in what is today the United States. People often compared the people they didn't like with Prophet Muhammad or the Ottoman Sultan as a way of saying that you're evil, you're unchristian, or maybe even anti-Christian. One example that I find really interesting is that of George Whitefield, who was a British evangelical preacher. He once insulted someone by saying that he was, quote, no more a true Christian than Muhammad or an infidel. Later, someone called him, and I quote, a Muhammad, a Caesar, an impostor, a Don Quixote, a devil, the beast, and a man of sin, the Antichrist. Something like half of those would be considered compliments today. So this is what people thought of Islam and Prophet Muhammad in much of Western Europe and the Americas, including the generation of the founding fathers. There were those here and there who didn't have such a negative view of Islam, but most did. That's what brings us to why Thomas Jefferson, a founding father and the third president of the United States, had a copy of the Qur'an. Thomas Jefferson bought an English translation of the Qur'an in 2 volumes in October 1765 for 16 shillings. Jefferson was only 22 at the time. The Qur'an was a translation by George Sale, which was first published in 1734 in England. Jefferson mentions that he lost his entire book collection in a fire at his mother's house in 1770. So it's not clear whether his copy of the Qur'an survived or if he bought a new one. Interestingly, if this Qur'an survived that fire, then this copy of the Qur'an actually survived 2 fires. Jefferson's entire library of 6,487 books was brought to the Library of Congress in DC, including the Qur'an. And then there was a fire in 1851 which destroyed around 2/3 of Jefferson's entire collection. So the Qur'an might have survived that fire as well. Anyhow, why did he buy it in the first place? Well, he was a student of law at the time, and so perhaps he wanted to learn more about Muslims. Because of that, or perhaps his curiosity was piqued by John Locke, his hero, who is also called the father of liberalism. And he was a big advocate of religious tolerance and pluralism. Jefferson's ideas about Islam would later in life completely be aligned with Locke's ideas about Islam. It's likely that Jefferson was reading it to understand law from other cultures and religions. As a law student, he was trying to expand his horizons to beyond Christianity and Western Europe, and that's probably why he acquired the Qur'an. He makes direct mentions to Islamic laws in some of his writings. In 1772, there was a divorce case in Virginia where a woman wanted divorce from her husband. Divorce was a bit complicated with Anglican Christians at the time, and Jefferson would need some kind of precedent. He goes looking into other cultures, such as the Japanese, the Jews, the Amazons even. He also mentions Islamic law in that case. He mentions that Mohammedans have a type of time-based marriage where a duration is fixed before the marriage and a certain amount of money is paid upon separation. That's quite accurate, but it's also not universal. It's called mut'a, and many Muslims consider it prohibited while others don't. I'm not gonna go into theology here. Now, I personally do not believe that Jefferson ever read the Qur'an that he had, at least not in its entirety and not deeply enough. This case is one of the reasons that I believe that. He mentions mut'a because it comes from the writings of a European scholar, but if he had read George Sale's Qur'an, he would have known that Islam actually allows divorce initiated by women in certain cases, which would have applied in this case because the wife here was claiming that her marriage was never consummated because of her husband's condition. In that case, Islam certainly allows women to initiate divorce. There's this illustration, for example, of a woman using her marital aid toy as evidence for her husband's inability to satisfy her. So this divorce would certainly have been granted under Islamic law. See, another reason that I think he didn't read or at least absorb Sale's Qur'an is because of Sale's own views on Islam. George Sale, the guy who translated the Qur'an that Jefferson had, was a British scholar, and he was quite well read on Islam and Islamic sources. He mentions quite a lot of additional stuff in his translation, and it shows a remarkable knowledge of Islamic law. His translation of the Qur'an is actually quite good, and it's neutral, maybe even positive compared to the views of most of his European peers. Because of this, the historian Edward Gibbon called him half a Musalman. Individuals who didn't actively have a negative view of Islam were often accused of being Muslim. Even Thomas Jefferson, despite having, for the time, typical negative views of Islam, would also be accused of being Muslim, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Jefferson's views on Islam come from other European thinkers, some of his liberal heroes. They don't come from the primary source that is the Qur'an. Still, despite having such a negative view of Islam, he was certainly an advocate of religious tolerance, and he didn't have a negative view of Muslims. By the time that he bought the Qur'an, he must have already been an advocate of religious pluralism. He writes about how Muslims and Jews are not people who should be considered enemies in perpetuity. Rather, he writes that there was no inherent hostility between Christians, Jews, and Muslims, and there's no reason for them to hate each other right out of the gate. So Jefferson believed that violence committed in the name of religion was purely evil and should be eradicated. He would carry this message in a big way come July 4th, 1776. On July 4th, 1776, 13 British colonies on the eastern coast of North America decided to band together to get their independence from the British Empire. In doing so, they signed a Declaration of Independence, which was authored by Thomas Jefferson along with 4 others. This founded the country of the United States of America. After this, Jefferson would work on the laws of both his home state of Virginia, known officially as the Commonwealth of Virginia, as well as the laws of the United States. In both cases, he advocated for the abolition of a religious establishment and proposed equal rights for all religions. In this matter, he even took some jabs at Islam by calling it a religion that repressed free inquiry and hence one to avoid imitating. An interesting fact here that not a lot of people know is that during the revolutionary times in the city of Baltimore in Maryland, there was a play called Muhammad by the French scholar Voltaire. The play is about fanaticism and extremism of the religious kind. Voltaire was trying to attack the religious establishment of his own time and country by criticizing Prophet Muhammad. The play has little to no historical accuracy. The events are basically fictional, with only a little historical set dressing, and Prophet Muhammad is a caricaturized evil person in the play. Even Napoleon Bonaparte criticized the play's depiction of the Prophet by saying that the play, quote, represents a great man, Prophet Muhammad, who changed the face of the world, acting like a scoundrel worthy of the gallows. Moving on, Jefferson and some others of his generation not only wanted equal rights for non-Protestant citizens of the United States, but also wanted them to be able to take office, eventually even become president, which was a big point of contention. The opponents of the idea raised the point that Catholics, Jews, and Mohammedans, pagans, and atheists, anyone could become president and change the face of the United States. A Catholic, according to them, would do the Pope's bidding and make the Pope the King of the United States. Same for Muslims, who would turn the United States into a vassal of the Ottoman Empire because they thought that all Muslims were subservient to the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. This was a pretty good point, to be honest, and even Jefferson and others like him couldn't deny this, and so they countered it by saying that the people would keep it from happening. A Muslim could run for office, sure, but the people wouldn't elect him. Interestingly, there was also discussion about how a non-Protestant would take the oath of office. For the Christians, they could swear on the New Testament, right? The Jews could do the same on the Old Testament, and the Muslims could simply swear on the Qur'an. But what about Hindus? Hindu holy scripture isn't exactly like the Qur'an or the Bible. The Bhagavad Gita wasn't always used to take oaths on, and James Iredell, who would be one of the United States' first justices to the Supreme Court, brings them into the conversation as well by bringing up that in the British Empire there were cases where a Hindu man would take oath by touching the feet of a priest. That's a very colonial way of thinking, but it shows how far the founding fathers were really thinking, and it's quite impressive in my opinion. Again, in these debates, there was so much anti-Islamic and anti-Ottoman rhetoric that I can't even go into like 10% of that in a single video. Anyhow, the founding fathers and others eventually managed to build the so-called wall of separation between church and state, giving, in theory, equal rights to people of all faiths, as long as they were white and free. White and free Muslims. I think maybe people from the Balkans could have qualified for that, I'm not sure. Certain Middle Eastern folks look white, but they might be stopped because of their name. Anyhow, in practice, things were very different. That's where the United States' claim to greatness really starts to crack up. Thomas Jefferson and the Founding Fathers and the Federalists had all kinds of talking points about freedom and equality, but really, who was it for? Here you can see the monument of Thomas Jefferson, and behind him you can see his famous statement, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. But really, how self-evident were these truths to members of his generation? So many of the founding fathers and members of their generation had slaves. So really, how self-evident were these truths to them? While they were imagining a future Muslim citizen of the United States, one with equal rights and a foreseeable route to the most powerful office in the United States, Muslims who were present in the United States at the time were being denied even the most basic of human rights and freedoms. Yeah, there were Muslims in the United States at the time of and even before independence. They certainly outnumbered Jews and maybe even Catholics, but we can't really prove that. Like Jefferson, President George Washington and other founding fathers were supporters of religious tolerance, and despite their openness to imaginary Muslim citizens, some of them were oppressing real present Muslims. For example, among Washington's slaves around 1774, there were two women from West Africa named Fatima and Little Fatima, who were mother and daughter, whose name, Fatima, would certainly suggest that they were Muslim. But there's no evidence that Washington realized that. To the founding fathers' generation, Muslims were Turks, not African. They knew that Muslims lived in the Middle East and North Africa under the influence of the Ottoman Empire. Similarly, other founding fathers had slaves, many of whom came from West Africa. It's also possible that there were freed former slaves, West African slaves, in the Revolutionary Army. But again, we don't know anything about them. It's certainly a possibility, but it's nothing that can be, or at least has been so far, proven. According to the historian Michael Gomez, around 255,000 Africans were enslaved from areas in West Africa that had strong Islamic influence. In 1756, there were around 120,000 African slaves in Virginia alone, and it's not unreasonable to assume that a significant number of them must have been Muslim. Slaveholders generally believed them to be pagans, and they never sat down with them, I imagine, to discuss religion, so they never knew. Two of the most famous Muslim slaves were Omar ibn Said and Yaruq Mahmud, or Muhammad Yaro. Muhammad Yaro was one of, if not the earliest Muslim residents of Washington, D.C. So Muslims have certainly been present in the United States since its founding. And all these ideas of religious freedom and liberties were not extended to these Muslims because they were African and they were slaves. The African enslaved parts outweighed the Muslim part. It's sad that these people have been removed from history. The vast majority of them is simply invisible. Not only was their freedom taken from them, not only were they taken away from their homes and their families, but their identities were taken from them as well. Their names were removed. Their connection to anything other than slavery was eliminated. A lot of them were renamed and eventually lost all touch to the lands of their birth. Despite the fact that Muslims have been here since before the United States existed, and despite the fact that religious freedom was established by the First Amendment, the first Muslim to be elected to Congress to represent people was Keith Ellison in 2006, 2 years before the first black president of the United States was elected in 2008. The wall of separation went up in the 1800s, making all religions equal. The slaves were freed in 1865. Women got the right to vote in 1920. Voting rights were extended for minorities in 1965. Those were things that were done through the law. But the law is not all that makes a country. Society and culture are also big parts of a country, and they're not very easy to change. The United States had to go to war against itself and win to free the slaves, but getting all white people to accept and not discriminate against African Americans took, well, they still haven't gotten to that point, to be honest. It's much more difficult. In many ways, winning the war was the easy part. It's much more difficult to change people than it is to change laws, and that's exactly what happened. Those Catholics and Jews and Muslims that were given equality by law found out that in practice, it wasn't that simple. From 1800 to, well, now, we're seeing discrimination against Jews and Muslims, and even Catholics at certain points. At the end of the 19th century, Muslims started to move to the United States from the Middle East. For the first time, the United States acknowledged that it had Muslim citizens. The path to citizenship was, however, a bit more complicated. Remember that part about being free and white? Well, these Muslims were certainly free, and their religion was certainly permissible, but were they white? Not all of them. In 1915, a judge ruled Syrians to be white because most Syrian immigrants were Christian, but Muslims of other ethnicities were still not white. It was left up to the judges to decide what to do there. In 1942, a Yemeni man who immigrated to the United States was denied citizenship, but in 1944, someone from Arabia was given citizenship. Interestingly, in that case, the judge mentioned that Islamic scholars like Averroes or Ibn Rushd and Avicenna or Ibn Sina had made significant contributions to European society and culture, and based on that, he granted citizenship to the man. Christian and Jewish relations were improved over the 1930s and 40s, when terms like Judeo-Christian were popularized, but Muslims, the third Abrahamic faith, still remained outside the circle. Not quite white, not quite black, not quite American. It was also during that time that Arabs came in large numbers, and many of them settled in Dearborn or Detroit to work in the auto industry. In 1957, in Washington, D.C., the Islamic Center was inaugurated by President Dwight Eisenhower, who ensured the Muslim community that they were, quote, just as welcome as anyone else. 44 years later, another president stood in that very building and reassured the Muslim community of its place in the United States on September 17th, 2001. Of course, we all know what happened just 6 days earlier. After 9/11, Muslims, and specifically Islam itself, came under target in the United States. Muslims were targets of hate crimes, and not just Muslims, but Sikhs were also attacked because white nationalists don't have enough brain cells to distinguish between the two. The shadow of the Twin Tower attacks still looms quite heavily over the Muslim community in the United States. Everyone who had to do anything with Islam had to specifically come out and condemn the 9/11 attacks. Muslims had to distance themselves from terrorism. Muslims, who had been seen as un-American for a while, were now seen as anti-American instead. Despite ensuring Muslims and saying, quote, Islam is peace in the Islamic Center, President George W. Bush passed the Patriot Act, which allowed the US government to spy on mosques and individual Muslims. Hundreds, if not thousands of people were unlawfully detained and even tortured by the US government. Much of it was headed by Bush's vice president, Dick Satan's Ballsack Cheney. So far, there have only been two Catholic presidents. President John F. Kennedy, elected in 1960, and President Joseph R. Biden, elected in 2020. There have been no Jewish or Muslim presidents. A Jewish president used to seem possible before the whole Trump thing happened, but a Muslim president never ever seemed possible. It's much easier to imagine the breakup of the United States than to imagine a Muslim president. But then again, Muslims are only 1.5% of the US population. But still, it's not just that Muslims are a small percentage of the United States population. It's also that Muslims are seen as different. There's Judeo-Christian, right? But there's no Judeo-Christian Islamic. So Islam is imagined as being outside the Trinity, despite the fact that Islam and Judaism are very similar, and Christianity is the odd one out. Also, historically, Jews and Christians have had a very violent relationship, while Muslims and Jews have had very peaceful coexistence. I've already mentioned Keith Ellison, the first Muslim United States congressman who was elected in 2006. But now let's talk about the first Muslim president. In Lakeville, Minnesota, on October 10th, 2008, a few weeks before the 2008 election, the Republican candidate for the presidency, Senator John McCain, was at a town hall, and a lady asked him a question about his opponent, a man named Barack Obama.
I got to ask you a question. I do not I can't trust Obama. I have read about him, and he's an Arab. He is not. No?
No, ma'am. No, ma'am. He's a decent family man, citizen that I just happen to have disagreements with on fundamental issues, and that's what this campaign is all about. He's not. Thank you. Thank you.
McCain shut down that woman and defended Obama as a family man. And while I'm sure that he meant well, it seems to imply that you can't be a decent family man and an Arab. Obama's own political campaign tried to make sure that people knew that he wasn't an Arab or Muslim. No one said he's not Arab or Muslim, but what if he was? Does that make him a bad candidate for presidency? Does that make him a bad person? Again and again, Obama tried to distance himself from being Arab or Muslim during this campaign and even during his presidency. And frankly, he wasn't wrong to do so. The truth is that Obama did what he had to do to win. It was up to the people to be better, and they simply weren't. Obama probably knew of the challenges associated with running for office in the United States and being associated with Islam. No less a man than Thomas Jefferson himself had been accused of being a Muslim during his presidential run. When Keith Ellison was elected, the Republican Congressman Virgil Goode Jr. wrote a letter to his constituents warning Americans to wake up. Keith Ellison decided to take his oath of office on the Qur'an of Thomas Jefferson rather than the Bible, and the conservatives made a huge deal about it, which is just stupid in my opinion. Why would you have a Muslim or Hindu or Jew swear on the New Testament? They don't believe in that to be a holy book, right? If I was swearing insincerely, I'd want to swear on a book that I don't believe to be sacred rather than a book that I do believe to be sacred. So I think people should swear on the book that they find holy. I believe that these days people do swear on the book that they hold sacred, and if they're atheist, they swear on the Constitution. Frankly, even with Ellison, it wasn't a big deal for him not to swear on the New Testament, except that he was Muslim. Obama's campaign, like I said, distanced itself from Islam. Obama himself asked Ellison not to speak on his behalf at a mosque in Iowa. His team removed 2 Muslim women in hijab to move them off camera while they were standing behind Obama during a speech in Detroit. He later called them, but still, what happened publicly can't be fixed privately. Now, attacks against Obama came for a number of reasons. Perhaps the biggest was that he was black, but his association with Islam was also a pretty big target. While Jefferson had no actual associations with Islam beyond his advocacy for tolerance, Obama did. Barack Hussein Obama's first and middle names come from Arabic. Hussein is quite famously a Muslim name. It was the name of the Prophet's grandson, and you'll find millions of men named Hussein in the Islamic world. He lived in Indonesia, the country with the largest population of Muslims in the world, as a child with his stepfather, who was apparently a Muslim. When Obama was registered in a local school, he was registered as a Muslim. Obama was attacked during his presidency as well as a Muslim, but he tried to prove his innocence in the matter by bombing as many Muslim countries as he could. The story of the United States and Islam goes back to before there was a United States, and there's a lot that I couldn't get to in this video. The script for this video was actually originally around 12,000 words, but I have problem editing videos that long, so I cut it short. If you want to read more on the topic, there's a wonderful book called Thomas Jefferson's Qur'an by Denise Spellberg, which was my primary source for the video. While I was in DC, I saw a lot of Islamic history in the museums there. For example, did you know that the fez was worn by soldiers in the United States Army at one point? During the Civil War, the 5th New York Infantry Regiment soldiers wore it as part of their uniform. In this photo, you can clearly see them wearing fez in the background. It once again shows that Islam and Muslims have been there since the very beginning. They're not some kind of outside people. See you next time. Don't forget to subscribe and press the bell icon. On the screen right now, you can see the names and tiers of the patrons. You can join them by pledging $1 or more to support the channel. Thank you for watching.